Okay, Rachel, thank you for being with us in Berkeley.
It's a pleasure.
I want to start by talking about form, because if you look up anything about these new novels, there's a lot to be said about form. And this notion that you have gut renovated the novel, as the New Yorker said, and that you're creating a new form. And I'm even thinking for people who are in here who maybe don't know what that means, that it would be helpful to start and to hear if you intentionally went to set about doing a new form and how you think of it.
Yes is the answer to the last bit of your question. So, I mean, for numerous reasons, which I guess we'll probably touch on in the course of a conversation about this stuff, I felt that the contemporary novel... I was told that you would let me know if you couldn't hear me, and you have. I felt that the contemporary novel had got away from reality, and that the whole idea of narrative and storytelling and plot and had run away over there, and that truth was somewhere over here, and that I suppose two things that readers expect to find, today's readers expect to find in today's novels are a story that is, in a sense, quite artificial, and that has, as they say, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the presence of the idea of imagination, so the feeling that the writer has made up the material, made up the story, made up the characters. And that was something that I felt increasingly opposed to. And I also felt that it could not even begin to represent the kinds of truths, I guess, that I was interested in exploring and formulating and uttering.
So prior to this, you had written 3 memoirs, and clearly the form of memoir is very truth-telling. And I'd like to hear how the memoir writing impacted these 3 novels, this trilogy, and whether you could have written this trilogy without having written the memoirs.
Well, the memoirs were the memoir was the form initially that I sort of fell upon as a thing that could contain material that I couldn't put in a novel for all the reasons that I've just tried to describe. And that form, the memoir form, I wrote a book about motherhood, I wrote a book about divorce, and I used I used myself as a template, as a canvas, I suppose, an example, and that really malfunctioned, that particular...
Well, let's talk about that malfunction a little bit. I mean, I do want to stick on the novels to a certain degree, but I have this sense of the experience of the novels being so informed by your experience as well, of course. And so you said out there that people were furious. It's pretty intense when you go online and hear or read about how people reacted to your memoirs. And I think it would be interesting to hear why you think people were so furious, and perhaps discuss with the audience, having taken time off after that experience, presumably because of having been eviscerated a bit by the media. But I wonder, if it went beyond that.
Well, I think it says something important about speaking about individuals, about being an individual, and how you tell or don't tell the truth. We are all individuals, but we're also extremely invested in belonging to our social groups, our communities, and so how people behave in terms of owning or disowning sentiments, experiences, all of those things. I don't think to me, a book, if I don't like a book, I won't read it. I'll just put it away. And so the idea of seizing on a testimony and using it to abuse the person who has given their testimony was a very, very particular, as I say, not a thing I would have expected from a reader. And it seemed much more readers, and it seemed much more a sort of group behavior. And the thing about the memoir is you're saying, I own these experiences. I'm going to say that this is what I felt. And of course that gives people the opportunity to say, oh, well, she feels that. And I don't feel anything like that.
Well, and how much of it do you think is a consequence of writing about the female experience, the anger?
Yeah, entirely.
Yeah, so maybe you could say a word about that, a little more, expand.
Well, I wrote a life's work, my book about motherhood. I know how long ago because I know how old my children are. So 18 years ago. And I still get exactly the same kinds of letters and responses from individual women that I did then, which is this is the only thing I've read that describes how I feel, and nobody understands how I feel. And so that seemed a very, very good example of sort of the problem of the individual truth against the sort of social interface. And in motherhood, as we all know, you can feel things, but there's in the maternal identity, there's a feeling of sort of social or communal responsibility. Part of your identity is given over to this other thing, and so that mechanism for not saying how you feel is quite powerful. So a lot of women who communicated with me about a life's work, I suppose what I felt was they would look at the response the book got and think, well, I'm definitely never going to bother saying, how I feel, because clearly this is what happens when a woman says how she actually feels about,
Well, and then you went on to write 2 more, and
yes, I did not learn from.
I get the impression that the 3rd memoir, which was about your divorce, was perhaps the most provocative and fury-inducing of all. So again, say more about that experience. I mean, do you like to be provocative, or is it just about truth-seeking, or a combination of things?
I still don't understand why the divorce book Aftermath, it's called, why that upset people. And it seemed, in those days, those were the last reviews of my work that I ever read. I walked the other way from that stuff then, and I don't sort of look at those things anymore. But when I did read those reviews, it seemed in each case that a very peculiar contradiction was there. And so point 1, criticism 1 would be, how can she expose her private life, her children, her and the second criticism was, she doesn't tell us anything. She doesn't give us any of the details. So it seems like if you wrote about your divorce and you really did write about yourself in non-universal ways, if you see what I mean, the very specific things about you and your life and your husband, and which I didn't, then everyone would be perfectly happy with that. So that's the conundrum that
it is.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Yes. So let's fast forward or through, perhaps, because then you took time off, which I'm imagining had something to do with the reception of the memoirs. And then this new form comes, and you seemingly take from the rule book of memoir, in my estimation, and you've been heralded as, this up and come. I mean, not up and coming. You've been writing a long time, but these are called masterpieces, genius. And people are saying you're completely, as we said, renovating the novel. So what do you make of it? And how is Faye different from you, the memoirist?
Well, I was talking with Sherilyn just now about this moment for, anybody who expresses things publicly that, importantly, have their name attached to them rather than, the sort of anonymous utterances that are everywhere. It's a really difficult moment to speak. Who is allowed to speak, and at what moment can what you say suddenly be conscripted into a dialogue of offence. I guess I had learnt these things before. When I wrote A Life's Work, certainly there was no social media, there was no. But I had learnt these lessons about, causing offence and being attacked and being misunderstood also. So I think that gave me a bit of a head start on these issues that, to me now, really, really do affect writers, or anyone who has to formulate language in the public realm, which is such an important task. It's such an important thing to do. It's so important to get things right, to exactly represent and honour, new truths, new realities. If nobody's going to do that, then I don't know where we'll be. But as I say, I kind of knew this, and my thinking in terms of this trilogy was really about that, was how can you speak without people knowing that you're speaking? And that was the form that I really spent, a period sort of working out, how that would be.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting. I mean, most of the reviews of the work say that Faye is passive. She is, but you're left to interpret very much about the characters, and the characters are, they're complicated, right? And you mentioned something about ambivalence out there, and I would love to hear a little more of a deep dive perhaps into ambivalence, because Faye seems ambivalent, and the characters, range, of course, they're very complex, and they're interpreting in this way. I actually wrote down a couple quotes that I wanted to say, because the New Yorker said, the characters are anecdotes, and they have a sheen of fantasy, a suggestion of myth, because they were saying that people don't articulate themselves that way. You must have approached it as a bit of a device to project onto them no one really does speak that way. I mean, you would be lucky to have someone, well, maybe not lucky. Maybe you wouldn't be lucky to have someone come and speak at you that way.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear about your interpretation and, how you chose to do it that way and why.
It is a semi-naturalistic form, I guess. I think that, there's sort of two questions you've asked, and one which is about the ambivalent sort of predicament that the book begins with, and it ends somewhere more the trilogy ends somewhere sort of more definitive than that. But, what has happened to this person who's narrating these books is that she doesn't believe in the story of life anymore. She doesn't believe in the narrative. She sees that what she thought was reality was in fact a belief state. So it's sort of, I guess, the Jungian idea of the midlife crisis as being the sort of collapse of personal reality and realizing that actually there is no special story, for you or for anybody. And I suppose part of what I was thinking in sort of designing these books was how do you actually represent that? How do you represent the loss of belief, the loss of story? How do you represent loss at all? Because a loss is a negative, an anti thing, and a book is a thing in space. It's a positive quantity.
Well, and you're speaking to dissolution, I think, to some extent. And you wrote, you're speaking exactly to another quote I wrote, which is, these are your words, the radicalism of the female experience, I think I'm paraphrasing here, but is how badly we all want our experiences to be unique, and how, in fact, they are so very much the same. And I wonder about that. Some people, of course, truly need to be special. And it seems that you're very interested in ripping the lid off of that.
Well, only as far as literary representation is concerned, because as I said at the beginning, to me, a very big wrong turning has been taken in contemporary fiction, which is that it is all about the special, about the extraordinary thing that happened, the one example of, and that seems to me not what the novel is for. It's not what any art is for.
And when do you think it took that wrong turn?
Well, I don't really have an answer to that.
It's curious, though. Are there novels that you feel that, was there a period of novel writing that you were reading, perhaps when you were growing up or studying, that you felt that these truths were better conveyed?
I think novels only reflect, their moment in history. And I think what is true to say is that all of us have struggled to free ourselves from the Victorian era, and that this sort of moment, or not moment, but period, particularly in my English culture, this period between, Victorianism and the 20th century, the two wars and modernism that came between those two things. The novel, the fact is, in that period, Virginia Woolf wrote The Waves, and yet to read a novel today, you would never know The Waves had ever been written, because the novel of today is constructed exactly as a Victorian novel was. So something in that is a clue, I guess, that what modernism tried to do, it didn't succeed, whereas in visual art it did succeed, and visual art has and music, those things keep reflecting, they keep inventing, they keep, and yet the novel didn't. It turned away from that.
Yeah, that's such an interesting observation. So I'm wondering then about your own, going back to this specialness or not special, your interest in the ordinary. It struck me as I was reading the final book, like this trilogy would be a perfect thing to put in a time capsule, and then someday someone opens up and it's like the exact description of just the most ordinary life in some way. And she's just going to cafes, she's on the plane, she's at a writer's conference. So what is this? Is this an exploration of of the ordinary, but the extraordinary part, of course, is the confessions, is what people are saying and the way that they're unpacking it, that I just found, I mean, people described it as dreamlike and mesmerizing, and it is that way. I mean, you really have to slow down, I think, to enjoy your novels properly. So I wonder if you could speak to that desire to unpack an ordinary experience.
Well, this sort of form of speaking is that I go in for in these books is. It's kind of writing in inverted commas. So what I'm trying to get at is what I believe is a completely native human grasp of narrative form. So I think a person is able to tell, it's what we do, you send your child to school aged 4 or however old, and they come home and you say, what happened to you at school today? And a child of 4 will tell what happened, and if he says something that makes people laugh, the next time he tells it, he'll make sure he puts that bit in and might change it a bit, and we learn how to formulate something that is made out of our own experiences. That we know we are giving to an audience, whether it's our mother or a big audience or readers, or so I think that ability, which part of my thinking in these books was kind of thinking about narrative and thinking, okay, where did the trouble start? Answer the Odyssey. And there's a lot of very deliberate sort of references to that, and the form of outline is very much, and its Athenian setting is sort of the big signpost towards that. I guess, not that turned out to. I felt that people would not understand these books and would not be able to read them. So I was sort of trying to say, look, this is sort of what I'm doing. I'm going back to that, telling about your traumatic experience afterwards, and that being also the psychoanalytic or therapeutic principle that something happens to you and you tell about it afterwards. And by telling about it, you alleviate yourself of some pain, some suffering.
Right. Well, it must be quite amazing to you if you thought that no one would be able to read these books, how successful they've been and the reception.
But clearly I never get anything right, because I thought people would really like my memoirs. So
you're working in reverse somehow. Yeah. To the themes, cruelty, which you have stated is a theme that you were trying to address. Is that in all 3 books or only in the final?
I know it's very much the second one, the transit.
The second one was. And so did you set out to explore like a particular theme in each book? Because I've also heard you say that it was centered around communal storytelling, and now you're talking about the therapeutic process, which I think overlap or perhaps are one and the same. So I'd like to hear you talk about the themes of the novels, and is it the case that you say, okay, this is going to be the theme of this novel, and then the story stems from there, or are you circling around that theme? How does that stay in your mind as you write?
I think what I had a real chance to consider in sort of formulating these books was how, and this seemed to have so much to do with femininity to me. How can you get it across, without being caught and caught, pigeonholed, accused, summed up. Oh, you're angry. Oh, you're. How can? So I thought, okay, I'm going to be, it's a minefield, I suppose, that, just to use that very hackneyed image. I thought, okay, I now recognize that this is a minefield, and how am I going to say and satisfy myself. Say everything that I truly observe in the world around me. How am I going to say those things without drawing this without making it an argument? Because when people argue, they don't listen to each other, and that was kind of what I realized. I thought, okay, I somehow have become embroiled in something adversarial simply by dwelling in these areas, simply by living pretty ordinarily as a woman. And if I read Madame Bovary, I completely believe that Flaubert's world, the world of Rouen, the countryside he describes, that's where he happened to exist. And so that's, and I believe that that's what I'm experiencing in his books, and likewise in what I have written. I've used the materials to hand. I've talked about what is in my world, and those things have been, I suppose, conscripted into something very adversarial in our social fabric, which is an argument, at one moment between men and women, at another moment between women themselves. How are you allowed to talk about having a baby, for instance? Who's allowed to say what? And if she says that, what does that make me feel? And do I defend this, or do I? So I really had tired of that, and I thought, okay, I do think, for instance, that the people who claim to care about children the most are the cruelest to them. I think that. So, and that's a very, very difficult thing to say without, if you say that out loud almost, then again, these things create arguments. So I went very, very, very slowly and carefully through the books to the themes that I
was going to say, it's subversive too, right? Because there's this desire to put in all of these ideas and thoughts. And to your point, it's so well received, but you're making arguments very loudly in some cases. And so this just makes me feel like it's a good point to ask you about whether you think of yourself as a feminist writer. I think of this sort of subversive feminist agenda that sometimes writers have. And someone wrote in a review of your work that your work was post-feminist. I don't think I even know what that means.
No.
So I would love to hear your thoughts on being a feminist writer. It seems that people call you that. And what do you do with a label like that?
Well, I think the almost the function of the label now is in response to the disavowing of feminism that has gone on. When I was the age that my daughters are now, 18, 20, the idea that you would even have to say that you were a feminist, that anyone would ever even ask you. Of course you were. That was what you were. And it's astonished me to watch the world go backwards in the way that it has in the last couple of decades. And now suddenly everyone has to get angry again and sort of stand up. And so yes, now you have to say, yes, I'm a feminist. For me, that has been a so much more an aspect of living rather than writing. I wouldn't necessarily say that I sit down with a sort of feminist agenda. I think you have to live the right life and then write something. So I write about these things simply because they are at the core of the way that I live, I guess.
Yeah, yes, and many women, I think. in this cut piece by Heidi Julavitz, she wrote, Cusk's version of womanhood can seem assembled from warnings and prohibitions. I liked that line a lot, and I think it's what you're speaking to. You know, you have to have lived a certain kind of life. So, can we extrapolate? You know, that there are warnings and prohibitions that have informed these novels.
Yes, I don't really understand her. I don't understand quite what she means, actually.
I guess I took it to mean that being a woman, you know, is what you're saying, full of minefields, right? And that if you're going to write about the female experience, that perhaps there are all of these places where you have these boundaried experiences, or, you know, warning signs, you know, that there are pitfalls all over the place. That's how I took it, and I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I think that would be much truer of a non of the non-expressive world, if you see what I mean, of a young woman actually just looking at what her life as a woman could be, might be, will be. That seems a very clear and still very problematic landscape to contemplate. I don't think it's any clearer to a young woman how she would, you know, manage to be and do the things that are expected of her. Right. I think, you know, the problem for me has been that I mean, you know, I'm a writer and I don't have any sense of prohibitions. I don't, you know, I have a completely naive interest in just trying to describe things very exactly and say what they are, and not thinking about what effect that will have or how it will make me look or what it will, you know. Right. So it might be that the warnings and prohibitions are a sort of side effect of, but I definitely don't mean to be issuing warnings. That's not.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and you've said of yourself you don't want to be, you're not interested in yourself as a subject, so that makes sense. You also wrote, whatever women are, they are institutionally disadvantaged, which sounds like a very feminist statement to me. And so I guess the larger conversation about this is the degree to which it informs this trilogy, you know, and how much it informs Faye's experience, or what you hope that the reader gleans from the experience of absorbing all these people coming at her. In some ways, I felt a bit that she was having to cope with all of these people and their stuff, not unwillingly. I mean, she could have walked away, of course.
Yeah, I mean, that's really about safety and not having any. You know, I'm trying to describe somebody who has sort of left the home, left the, you know, no longer has the sort of front door to shut, you know, and the world inside. I mean, the situation of these books is very much about anonymity, transience, not because those things have all that much to do with writing, but they do have to do with people and what happens to people when they are outside, whether temporarily or permanently, structured modes of being. For the woman who Faye sort of partly is, she is, you know, she's a writer, but she's also a woman who has lost family life, institutional womanhood. You know, that's a very frightening place to live, that anonymous place. So yeah, it's not a thing about writing.
So much. Is Faye having a midlife crisis?
Well, I mean, in the end, the place that I didn't know whether I would be able to arrive at anger in this form, with all of its careful sort of distancing and And Kudos does get to that place, and it does deal with one female response to these institutionalized ways of living, which is to say, I want nothing more to do with it. I want nothing more to do with men. I'm going to protect my child, and I'm going to live. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to do everything, because actually I was always doing everything anyway, and I just allowed the illusion that it was all shared, to exist. So I think that, part of what you were talking about earlier, the woman writer has a choice. There's a whole world of literary values that are essentially male. In the Virginia Woolf formulation of this, they are male sentences, male paragraphs, almost a male identity. And a woman writer can go and be like that, can live in that context and be very successful and write things that people enjoy that nonetheless don't touch on what is radical in, what remains unfortunately radical in femininity, because it's not finished, it's not over, it's not fully evolved. The Fae person is much more pursuing that, I think.
Yeah, and it strikes me that women get more kudos, to use the title, for emulating male writing structures. So that's perhaps a reason why people tend to stay in that lane.
Yeah.
About publishing, I don't think I've heard of a literary trilogy. Maybe I haven't dug deep enough. And so I'm curious about, it's such a popular form, of course, in genre fiction, science fiction and romance and YA certainly. So was this something that you thought of, that you partnered with your publisher with from the beginning? And you've already now confessed you didn't think anyone would read it, but now I wonder, was anyone worried about sustaining the interest over a trilogy?
Well, they're all quite short.
They are quite short, yes.
And the print is quite large. I was amazed how much they sort of spaced it out to make it...
It could have been one long book.
It would definitely make a noise if you sort of threw it against the wall. No, and in fact, the Balkan trilogy, the Olivia Manning, that was an influence in that it is an extraordinary, and those are long, meticulous, works of great information and detail, in which, and narrated by a woman, right. And they are without emotion, and they are narrated by a woman who is suffering, who what she tells, what she describes, the way that she describes people treating her, you know that she must be suffering terribly, and yet you never know anything about it. She doesn't talk about it. So that was a big. Okay. Carl
Narsgaard has certainly written these ridiculously long tomes. So there is precedent, of course. I thought more for men. Thought he got away with that in part from a bit of a male perspective. Mm-hmm. So, but it still brings me back to the question of, it's ambitious, and was it something that was from the beginning a trilogy, or was it something that unfolded as you began to write?
No, I definitely didn't conceive of it as that. Partly, as I say, because I truly did not think. I wrote outline in a state of great isolation, and when I'd finished, and I wrote it very, very quickly, and when I'd finished it, I did sort of look at it and think, that's not going to make very much sense to people. And so I wasn't in that moment going to consider sort of doing more of that. But very quickly, as once it became clear that actually people did understand what I was trying to do, the question of what this floating, dispossessed person, how she would actually live in the world, because the outline is a few days away for a work thing. You know, she's got to come back. She's got to have a home. She's, you know, her life. So that seemed to me, you know, how would you actually live in this way? That seemed to me a question that needed to be answered. So and then from there to how do you actually defend your truth, properly defend it from, again, this very eviscerated standpoint. So that, yeah, needed a third one.
So I think we're going to turn to Q&A here pretty soon, right after this question, which is just a question about what possibly will you tackle next?
Well, I mean, the question of I have sort of two subjects, and one is what we were talking about earlier, the question of speaking and the fear of the increasing fear of saying anything in our times, and the other is about whether you're still a woman after a certain point, whether gender still exists after a certain point in life, whether we are still gendered, and what that part of a female life it sort of is. Yeah.
Lucky us, I can't wait. All right, wonderful. So the way that we're doing Q&A, just to set this up, you guys, is you're going to have to move to the aisles because the people who are running the mics are going to hold on to the mics. That's just a rule that we're doing. And so people who are in the middle, don't be shy. People who are not in the middle, be gracious. And we'll move people to the aisles to ask the questions.
Do you think that it's about place, and that the place would be, the place where your books are set, is in the nowhere of our now anomalous, strange land?
That's very meta.
Yeah, I mean, I very deliberately chose those because the other thing about my narrator is that she has 2 children, and I had to find, it's not just place, it's time. I had to find times when she would not be with those children, because that seemed to express something very, very close to the core of the dilemma of, you know, this female writer anyway. You know, how can you be alone in order to create something? So to me, time is very much a location as well.
Okay, thank you. I just want to mention that it seems so strange to me because the entire time I'm hearing you, I'm thinking, you're an artist. It's almost like somehow we haven't quite moved to the place where we recognize that the art is the art and it's not merely a story.
I mean, the thing about an art or an artistic venture is that it needs it needs autonomy. It needs its own independence. It has to go its own way, and it needs time, and it needs individuals to live in it, recognize it, feel something about it. That's a hard thing to represent as a social person. It's not something that I can convey by being here physically and talking. So it's the only thing that I'm interested in. How others I suppose, relate what I have created to, their own lives, or is not up to me. If it's of interest, I guess that's why one gets asked to do these things. If it's of interest to know how much, what degree of socialized consciousness went into the thing that you've created, fine. I think it's clear enough from reading the book what
I'd also like to say, though, that you've been very celebrated for your prose. And so that in itself is an art form. I think that you could simply say, yes, the art of the prose on the page is quite exquisite. So it is another medium, and a good question. Thank you. We have a lineup over here.
Hi.
Hi.
Two quick questions, both from Kudos, so it's still fresh on your mind. So there's a mention there that book festivals don't really penetrate into the workings of writers. So how would you design an event in a book festival to be more successful? And my second question, you've already alluded that Kudos says the women are a lot angrier about men. And indeed, in our first two books, Faye gets to flirt, she gets slayed, the men are more relatable. So I was just wondering if there's been some change in your own feelings towards men, or maybe more pessimism about men-women relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know the answer to that. I think that what I was trying to describe was the path a residue of anger might take, how anger might continue to make its way through you afterwards, and that it doesn't go away, and that it creates, that it will create an image of itself in the end in a life. So what I describe across the three books is somebody who begins in a state of destitution, emotional destitution, and is very frightened. And by clinging very carefully to what she can affirm personally, what she can see and hear and kind of affirm, and proceeding from there, she gains substance. And this is really to me the basic sort of unit of not just of creating but of being. So she fills herself in, and what's left at the end of that is merely a capacity to deal with, or give birth to, or give voice to the anger or the trauma or pain, or of memory, and that seems a very sad idea to me. So the book ends, in a very ambivalent. I have no answer to your first question about the book festival. I would say everyone should just have a party or something. Go out to dinner, have some fun.
I think we'll take just a couple more questions of the people who are lined up, and then we'll wrap it up. Are these people sitting on the stairs? On this side as well. Okay. Yeah, I think we just need to take 3 more questions, if we could.
Oh, do you want to start here? Okay. Thank you. I begin by admitting that I'm only halfway through the trilogy, but in transit, I am so in awe of how you describe the casual cruelties that happen throughout and particularly how deftly you handled the book festival, and I'm just remembering the quote, a quote from it uttered by Oliver, who talking about casual cruelty, he said, the humility that was involved in maintaining the pretense of normality. And it sent a chill through me in this age of Me Too, how frequently that's a female experience of having to adapt to the unadaptable. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the process by which you get the idea of the casual humiliation rather, and then expand it out and give it context and
That's perfectly stated. Perfectly stated.
Perfectly stated, and yet I don't quite understand what.
I think
what
she's
the question
asking,
is.
if I could, interpret, it's just this, all of these little, because I wondered that too, is like all these little cruelties that you portray these characters having in Faye, witnessing. Do they come from your own experience? Are they things you've observed yourself, things that are just human nature? I think she's wondering about the origin of these experiences that human beings perpetrate onto one another.
Or is it just a brilliant creation,
Sprung from Zeus, yes.
So what you're asking where
Memoir.
where my material comes from, which I'm obviously not going to tell you anything about. I think I'm interested in analysing and representing the texture of experiences in their proper proportions and without extremity. And I guess it seems to me that part of what gets left out of a lot of people's stories about themselves is a consciousness of cruelty. It's almost like you have been programmed to. I mean, just like if I'm sitting right here and I'm in pain, I'm not going to show that I am because this is a social interface. So I think that particular sensitivity or sort of attempt to desensitize oneself, I relate it completely to childhood and to part of the social contract that essentially to every human at a certain point says you have to grow up and put a brave face on it and take your sort of position in the picture.
That's interesting. Thank you. Maybe a final question here.
Hi. Thank you for your writing. I was going to ask why, as you said, that you are trying to grapple the interesting questions that you have, or the questions of life and the ideas around life, and that you use observation to look as closely to find the truth of that, and then put that into words. And I'm curious why you're attracted to fiction and the memoir as the methods to doing that. And for instance, why not, or instead of like the academic philosophical tradition that would often deal with observations to back up ideas and life?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question that I think directly concerns gender, actually. And now that I'm sort of practicing sort of adult, whatever, intellectual writer, and yes, a few other things as well, probably. I see that some of my contemporaries they started closer to their goal than I did, and for whatever reason, and that scholarship or intellectualism offered a less gendered refuge, I suppose, for thinking and expressing. And I mean, this is something, I don't know if you're familiar with Anne Carson, the poet. So this is something that she said a little while ago, and I just thought it really did sort of hit me in the face. That was never possible for me, and I couldn't. I had to go a very, very, very long route of only ever being able to say something or claim something because I had verified it myself. To be in the place of scholarship is, and I mean, this is, a lot of what I read is psychoanalytical writing, for instance, because it so amazes me that in that world, things that people cannot articulate about themselves or one another are almost treated as a diagnosis. That's still so interesting to me. So I imagine if I will end up in that philosophical position, but it will have taken me such an incredibly long time to get there.
20 more books in you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel, for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.